Amrita. It's such a delight to have you here. It's always a delight to actually talk to someone who's gone through a huge journey in their career, and this is a pleasure to actually host you in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sowjanya, for the invite. And it's a pleasure speaking to you too.
So we start off with, I think today, the next 20 minutes, what I wanted to have as a conversation is the journey to the cloud. How does one go through that, whether it is a large enterprise, SMB, or an SMC organization? At the core of it, I think it's not an IT decision. It's a very strategic business decision to actually adopt the cloud. And there are multiple nuances that come in. Oftentimes we just hear cost as one aspect. There are multiple other aspects one needs to consider. And it also needs to involve various business leaders, the various roles that are there driving, whether it's supply chain, marketing, sales, etc., to come together to actually have a strategic intent as well as the process of decision making. Talk to me a little bit about your experience and your thoughts on how do you go about defining a strategy for cloud adoption?
Thanks, Sowjanya. I think it's important to understand as to why we are doing the cloud journey, right? If you look at the traditional way of having an infrastructure on premise, you have to manage the capacity and the throughput and the availability of that infrastructure. You have people managing that. And when IT is not really a core business, you really struggle with that aspect. Secondly, when you go to the cloud, it gives you a lot of functionality of DevOps, of high availability, of being able to fail over from one to another. So there are lots and lots of benefits of going to the cloud, whether it's a large organization, medium size, and of course, I mean, the startups which are really getting born in the cloud, really speaking, because that's all they know. Yeah. Having an on-premise infrastructure when you're being a startup makes no sense at all, right? So there are different drivers of why one should go to the cloud, and one should be very clear about what is the strategy, why you want to go to the cloud, what are the KPIs you're driving, what's the objective of this cloud journey, whether you are a large organization which has a lot of IT legacy and infrastructure. When they're moving, their objectives would be very different from, let's say, when a startup is starting off and they need infrastructure versus an SMB, which is looking for like an ECIO service or a virtual service. So all of them have different drivers and they come from a different angle in their cloud journey. And you're very right, when it's a large organization, not only there are the drivers of the infrastructure, but now applications, like if you look at Salesforce or if you look at ServiceNow, they're all in the cloud. Yeah. So when you have the discussion, you have it more from a business application point of view. You look at productivity tools like Microsoft Office 365, which is in the cloud, as opposed to having a mail exchange in your premise. Right. So when you're going through that journey, obviously you will have to decide it at the strategic level. Of course, the CIO or the CTO is a big decision maker, but so are the other, business owners when you're implementing a new, package or a new business application. Of course, if it's an infrastructure related strategy that is being thought through, then the CIO and the CTO has to think through how they will go through the journey of moving applications to the cloud or having new applications in the cloud and so on and so forth.
So one of the things I have seen, I've been on both sides as part of the CIO office and also as a seller. And from that experience, one thing I've noticed, Amrita, is how we look at this strategically, right? There are multiple aspects that also come in: security, network, your infrastructure, your skills, data. Where does the data reside? Who controls the data? So in your experience, do these get into the strategic conversation?
So yes, you're right, Sowjanya, that there are many aspects that we need to consider besides the cost, which you mentioned before. For example, the network, the security and data, as you mentioned. And a lot of times I have seen that whether is the CIO's organization or the the business owners, don't necessarily delve into those aspects of it. I mean, there is more and more awareness coming, of course, now, and therefore there are talks, and people are aware. In the early days, it was just move to the cloud, and it's beneficial, and so on and so forth. And one of the biggest things actually is the network connectivity. When you're moving such a huge amount of data and applications in the cloud away from your captive infrastructure of network, which was an MPLS, etc. When you don't have that leverage any longer, you have to be very, very clear as to what is your network architecture. What is the transformation you need to go through on your network side, whether you need to move your MPLS to SD-WAN because you need to be able to do on-demand capacity management and so on and so forth. Security, I mean, because now the cloud infrastructures outside your control, outside your premise, really, security, tunneling, etc., has to be very, very strong. So those are definitely aspects that need to be considered. The other aspect, which is very hot today, is about data and data privacy and sovereignty and all of that. So that's a whole new discussion that has started off changing the landscape of how cloud had started off, which were very controlled, centralized sort of geography, huge thing. Now it's becoming more fragmented in country, but still, at least you have the other aspects, the wrappers of DevOps, management, capacity on demand, etc. Those benefits are definitely there.
Now, if I don the hat of, you talked about this early on, if you're a startup and you're embarking right away on a cloud journey, it's a different ball game. But in India, we're very rich on legacy applications. We sit on legacy applications. And you take any industry vertical, there are new solutions from startups as well as consulting firms which provide these niches which can be plugged into your vertical. So there's also a decision of whether you continue what applications, core versus context, that moves to the cloud. Do I buy off the shelf and then customize? That aspect also goes into your strategic decision making, isn't it?
Very much so. Your legacy application cannot necessarily take the advantage of a cloud infrastructure. It cannot use the functionalities of a cloud. So, when you say cloud ready, though, that is an aspect of consideration, that you're moving your legacy applications to at least consume some of the cloud functionalities that is there. They're not cloud native applications, right? So you have to be very careful. And many a times it is possible that a virtualized environment in your premise is much more cost effective, especially if you've got people who have been managing it for a long time. So you can't take a paintbrush and say everything is going to move to the cloud and it'll be beneficial. Every application needs to be evaluated, whether it makes sense to leave it on premise, whether it's been virtualized. Maybe virtualization has a better benefit than putting it into the cloud. So for the legacy, I mean, for me, it's actually three pillars to be considered. One is what legacy you have and how much of that do you really need to move to the cloud and why. Second is all the digital assets that you're now incorporating, which is AI, ML, AR, VR, or data lakes, etc. All the new applications that you are, where it's the natural tendency to put it in the cloud. Very well. How does that connect into the legacy, and how do they interact, whether it's API based? And the third pillar, which is the network connectivity. When they have to talk to each other, the data is now getting spread more and more. Therefore, it is siloed already within the legacy applications, but imagine now with the data lake concept and with all of that, you need to have your network working seamlessly so that you have the required latency and the bandwidth to be able to give good customer experience. In all the journey of the cloud, I mean, one of the things always that has to be kept in the forefront, is the customer experience from whatever you're doing in the cloud, right? If the customers are unable to use the application and are unable to download the data, or are unable to sort of leverage the benefits of the clouds, it's really useless. So network transformation, I keep repeating that to many organizations that I'm advising and consulting with, that do not forget that aspect of it. It's like looking at the engine beneath the car hood, really. It's not the shiny pieces only that matter. It's also what's really getting the whole thing working properly.
So you brought out an interesting thought in in the previous conversation, which is you need to be customer centric when you're thinking about this. That also means that you need to really chalk out the journey map and the various touch points of your customers, whether it's digital or physical, and thereby then identify what applications actually migrate to the cloud and not. And also from a security point of view that you were talking earlier, one part of it is security on the cloud. The other part is security within as well, right? So you need to also consider, thereby considering the number of breaches that are happening in the last 1 year, it's not something that you just create.
It's non-trivial. Yeah, it's non-trivial, absolutely. In fact, it's become much more harder as far as security is concerned, because now things are not necessarily in your control, right? I mean, you are opening it up and it's not a captive network that you are dealing with, and therefore you can't fortify it in the old sense as such, at the perimeter, and do things internally as such. So much more the game has been up, and security has become much more critical and non-trivial in the cloud environment, especially when you're allowing the cloud infrastructure and the cloud applications to interact with your legacy applications and your on-premise application. And also, I mean, with COVID, of course, it's got accentuated, but when you are giving access to your applications, your enterprise applications, to different touch points, whether it's the customer touch point, whether it's your retailer, whether your branches, your factories, or the different users within the enterprise, you have to be very, very clear as to what is the access method and how secure is that access method when you're giving access to these applications. Right. So security is absolutely an important aspect that needs to be considered when you're migrating into the cloud.
Yeah. And I want to also segue into another part. We started off with cost being commonly known as one of the drivers. But along with the cost of migration, of course, it streamlines your cost a lot. But along
Does it? I mean, that's the point, actually, Sowjanya. Lot of initially when we started off, it was about that, because we don't need so many DevOps people, we don't need so many people to, and the capacity management can be done on demand and so on and so forth. But my personal experience has not necessarily been that the cost is lower. Yeah. Especially so because you really don't know how the costs are being calculated, and sometimes you have unutilized reserved resources that you keep that are being costed for, which is unnecessary. So this whole new concept of FinOps, having the financial control over the operations is becoming very, very critical. So people who have been involved in, let's say, the IT service management or the NOCs in monitoring the infrastructure have now got to be aware on how is the cloud costing them, right? What are the various, resources that are being utilized? What is the implication of the cost? It's not price into quantity that really works here, because there are so many other aspects and services that get costed. And sometimes it's so much on demand that you have you can't think of these things. So therefore, I would say be aware that it is not necessarily that the cost is going to be lower than your on-premise. Do your homework properly and know why you're moving to the cloud. And once you have done that, then monitor and keep a close watch in optimizing the cloud resources. That's the word. It's the optimization that is required constantly. If you don't use some resource in the night, the good thing is that it is on demand, and you can model it in such a way that you can bring down your costs quite effectively. But what is happening in reality is people don't realize that so much focus needs to happen in this aspect of the operations, that when at the end of the month or whenever the bill comes, then there's a shock.
Yeah.
So I would say, yes, cost can be lower, but you have to know how to manage the cost and monitor the cost and optimize the cost to be really effective.
Also be aware of the TCO aspect once you go on to the cloud. That's what you're also talking about in terms of what are some of those contributors, and thereby what are some of the metrics I will have in the system to constantly measure and optimize that as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So having that financial acumen on top of what is needed to be optimized as far as the resources in the cloud are concerned and what services are costed in which manner, and constantly modeling that utilization in the day, utilization by the hour, utilization in the end, what is going to be backed up, how the failovers are being configured, what is really critical for a failover versus, just doing a blanket failover configuration. It'll cost you.
Yeah.
So earlier, because it used to be in step function as such and not on demand, people had to justify each increase. So it was easier to control. Today, it's a configuration and on demand. So you sit and configure it. One of your operations guys configures it and you don't even know about it. Then you're in for a shock at the end of the month with the bills, right? So those are the things that one has to be aware of. If you're aware, you manage and optimize your costs, then it is definitely beneficial, because there are lots and lots of pluses for moving to the cloud, right? And you don't have to buy your own hardware, you don't have to do the evaluation, you don't have to have your own people to manage it, the failover is easier. So lots and lots of benefits as an organization, but be very, very careful on how you're managing and optimizing the costs.
So one question I had here was, do you consider all of this as part of your strategic planning, or is this something that evolves as you sort of identify your architecture, the cloud architecture, and then define these metrics?
So it needs to be both ways. What I mean by that is you do need to, as we said in the very beginning, that when you start off on your cloud journey, you need to have a full strategic objective, a vision, where do you want to go with this, why you're doing it, what are the KPIs, etc. So that definitely needs to be put in place. How is it that the new application, the digital applications are going to talk to the legacy, and all of that needs to be done in the very beginning. But it's not a one-time exercise, right? Then once you start implementing, you need to monitor and manage it against whatever you said you were going to deliver as far as TCO is concerned and as far as the other KPIs are concerned, and then continue to optimize it. And then maybe in a year and a half, you revisit the whole strategy and see what's working, what's not, because you assume a lot of things when you start off, because when your applications are not cloud ready, you have to put in the cost of moving it and making it cloud ready. What are the new applications with are cloud native, and how do they work with your legacy applications? There are lots. It's a major transformation, really, and it's not a one-time thing. It's ongoing for at least 2-3 years before you can say, yeah, I've done whatever I can, I've moved whatever I can to the cloud, and I've got the benefits of this, and I'm managing the cost properly, and I am able to benefit from that. I've done the network transformation, I have secured it very well. So it's a large transformation overall, right?
One interesting thing you also brought about is the measure, right? I strongly believe when you don't measure something, you really don't know how you're progressing either. But what you're also then talking about is not just measure the metrics in terms of cost, in terms of performance. There are other attributes that you also have to look at. And it's not just an IT metrics that we're talking about. It is the end-to-end journey map, and thereby the metrics that maps across, right? In your experience, what are some key KPIs for an organization to consider and to review on a regular basis?
See, there are definitely the cost elements that are there, the aspects of how much FTEs you are saving and you are able to manage with, those elements are definitely there. The application also matters. Sometimes when you, for example, if you're moving from your on-premise trouble ticket ITSM application to an in-cloud application, a lot of times it's not the same application that you're migrating to the cloud. You're actually doing an application transformation, right? And I'm not going to particularly take names, but as an example, all the new genres of ITSM, which are cloud native, people are looking at it like a business transformation. So there are new business processes that have to be implemented. There is a new application that needs to be implemented. And then there is the data migration process, and then it's in the cloud. So it's not necessarily a cloud, migration, infrastructure migration. It's adopting cloud natively with the new applications. And that is a business transformation journey. It's not an infrastructure or an IT journey that you're going through. And therefore, those KPIs have to be, again, business led. So when you're moving to the cloud in these, what are the functionality? A lot of these applications are bringing in a lot of new functionality, a lot of AI, ML, proactive monitoring, proactive closure of tickets. As an example, I'm just taking one business process and illustrating it to say why being in the cloud also means a business transformation, especially when you're adopting a new application as such. So those are aspects that have to be considered from a business angle, and of course, from an infrastructure and an IT or a technology aspect, there are KPIs of, has it improved the availability? Has it improved the customer experience in terms of latency and bandwidth? Has it improved the security? Is the cost under control? Do you have people who can manage it properly, and so on and so forth?
So one thing I've also seen in my experience, Amrita, is around skilling, right? When you're going on this journey of transformation, it's not just the skilling from cloud know-how, it's also culturally you're changing the way you look at your processes, the way you sort of engage with customers. Various touch points are going through transformation. Talk to me a little bit about your experience on the role of skilling as well as culture in this transformation.
So like we took two parts to it. One is if there's a application which is native in the cloud and you're migrating to that, which has a lot of business impact, process impact, and you run it like a business transformation project, right? So that has got a different nuance and different skilling to be done over there. A lot of times these applications actually are being pushed or are being brought in by the CMOs or the CDOs or the the business owners, saying that we want this to be implemented. So how do you bring in the changes and the process changes that are necessary over there? That's the one aspect. The other aspect is you do need to reskill your IT teams and your infrastructure team to be able to know what cloud is, what does being cloud native mean, what are the other aspects. Now, the focus has to be away from monitoring to managing, correct? And optimizing, right? So earlier in the NOCs, you were monitoring all the time, seeing what has gone down, what has come up, how do you, repair, mean time to repair, all of that. Those are gone. Yeah, so those are sort of things that actually the cloud vendors are taking care of. And therefore your job becomes now, how do you manage that and how do you optimize that so that your costs are much more controlled? So there are different aspects that you have to go through in terms of reskilling. A lot of the team members who have been part of your team are not aware of these things. And therefore you need to reskill them and you need to train them on the new infrastructure.
Yeah. One last aspect that I've also seen is, and it applies more to companies which are of Indian origin but have customer bases worldwide, is also the regulatory aspect, right? Like whether it's in India or otherwise, and depending on your sector, there's quite a lot of regulatory overheads that you need to take care of.
True.
How do you incorporate that as part of your strategic planning?
See, you need to be aware is what is the country regulation as far as data is concerned. And you would have seen a lot of discussion in India, and it's happening in every country. It's not only in India, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in the US, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere you go. Data governance is a big topic. Privacy of the data. Governments are not allowing tech companies to take the data outside the country, right? Because it is the data of that country as such. So that is becoming more and more regulated and tighter, right? So being aware of what the regulations are of that country and the possibility of what is going to change, it's going to become more and more tighter. So when you are having the conversation with your cloud vendor or your infrastructure vendor, you have to know these aspects and then work out the architecture accordingly, so that you are not left in a situation where you're not compliant with the regulations. It's extremely important to be aware of that when you walk into this transformation. In fact, a lot of them are already midway, but it's time to now consider what the regulations are saying, what is anticipated, and therefore how you're going to change your strategy and vision. That's why I said that every 2 to 3 years you have to revisit, because the situation is evolving, technology is evolving, regulations are evolving, everything is evolving, and therefore being in line with all of them and working step by step towards all of this is going to be important.
Amrita, any parting thoughts as we wind up?
I would reiterate, Sowjanya, is that while cloud has a lot of benefits, no doubt about it, and that's the reason why everybody is doing that, but be aware of what really fits in your environment, what is necessary to do and what is nice to do, and how are you going to manage the costs and manage the security, and how are you going to transform the network to leverage all this capability that is coming in.
Makes sense. And what I'm also taking away is it's not just a department, it's a top down, it's a business driving the whole transformation.
True.
And so you need to think of it holistically, not in terms of applications as moving to the cloud.
Correct.
That's a big way as well. Hey, Amrita, thank you so much. It was a delight talking to you, and look forward to meeting you sometime. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.